Hi, everyone. As Will said, welcome to this mini course, The Odyssey of Homer, a close reading. I'm delighted to be part of Hopkins at Home, and I'm so pleased that you've decided to revisit or visit the Odyssey for the first time. I'm not assuming any knowledge of it, but if you are familiar with it, when we have our discussion section, I will get a better sense of the various levels of familiarity you all bring to the text. Tonight I'm going to, in this first 3 lectures, I'm going to talk about the structure of the Odyssey. And by the way, I will join you in person for the discussion section. I'm not totally expert at switching back and forth between PowerPoint and screen. So we're starting with this, and then I will turn off the PowerPoint for the discussion section. Tonight, I want to point primarily to the content of the first 4 books. This includes the Council of the Gods on Mount Olympus, which you see pictured here on this ceiling fresco, and the journey of Telemachus, sometimes called the Telemachy. So for the morning, we'll leave this fresco, but I'm going to get a certain amount of mileage out of it tonight, so you'll see it again. We're using the translation by Richmond Lattimore. The work of all translators varies in terms of word choice and phrasing, so it's important for all of us to have the same translation. And I like this one because Lattimore retains the sense of the formulaic epithets, which I'm going to talk more about right now. First, though, this next slide is a little bit silly, but it makes its point. I'll give you just a brief overview of the Greek poetic line. Dactylic hexameter is not something we encounter often in English poetry. Longfellow tried it. You may remember the line, when in the forest primeval, da 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 da. So that, I see someone nodding, that is dactylic hexameter, the bump up a bum for 6 syllables. And then in the Greek poetic line, the last foot can be 2 longs or a long and a short. That's enough of that. The reason, and just to add here that the word hexameter has a Greek root hex that we still encounter in English words like hexagon or 6-sided polygon. So hexameter is really familiar, but perhaps not in terms of poetry, but this isn't a science lecture. So this slide is actual epithets. You see an epithet for Odysseus in the first line here, the man of many ways. And that in Greek is poutropon Odysseus. And so the reason I'm familiarizing you with the poetic line is that these epithets are designed to fit into it in various places. Poutropon Odysseus assumes a long syllable before the first word, and then it slots right into that part of the line. Much enduring Odysseus, Polytlos Odysseus, fits into a slightly different slot. Greaid Athena, Thea Glaucopis Athene, again fits well at the end of a line because her name has 2 long syllables, Athene. So you will often, Lattimore tries to echo these, so you can watch for them. And then I think we are all familiar with rosy-fingered dawn, although perhaps not in Greek, Rhododactylos Eos. All right, so much for my Greek pronunciation. I hope there are no professors of Greek here. So let's look at the proem, or the introductory verses of the Odyssey, which end with an invocation of the muse. These opening verses actually include an abbreviated summary of the Odyssey's storyline. The war in Troy is over. The victorious Greek soldiers are now making their various journeys home. These journeys, a single journey is referred to in Greek as a nostos. Odysseus is trying to accomplish his nostos, and the plural form is nostoi. There are collections of many epics about these various nostoi, not all of which were successful. Agamemnon is a primary example of that in this epic. He is the counterexample of Odysseus, who does eventually make it home to Ithaca. Agamemnon is murdered by his wife's lover. His wife Clytemnestra does not want him to come home. So Penelope is a key player, and we'll get to more of her in our third meeting. So let's see how much we can get out of the proem. Odysseus traveled on far journeys. He saw many cities. He learned the minds of many men. He's collecting data. Odysseus collects data because he's a man of many ways. He adapts to the circumstances in front of him. He suffered many pains, but he learned from those suffering experiences. And as I think all of you, and in Greek, suffering can also mean learning. And as I think all of you know, learning is hard. It does hurt to learn. That's a familiar concept in Greek. Odysseus tried to save his companions, struggling to save his own life. And a couple of times he comes very close to losing it. But his companions sealed their own fate when they ate the cattle of Helios. And Helios took away their homecoming. So what's been mentioned so far in these first few lines is basically a synopsis of the first 12 books, but it's given to us here in what seems to be a lot of kind of scattered detail. Where does the sun god come in, for example, and what's up with his cattle? What cities? We actually never do find out much about the cities. How is the epic poet going to impose order on all of this? In the end, he simply dodges responsibility and hands it over to the muse. From some point here, goddess, daughter of Zeus, speak and begin our story. I always find this a little funny because he's giving up responsibility and just letting her take over. So the muse chooses to begin with the Council of the Gods on Mount Olympus. So that brings us back to my favorite slide. But when does this council take place? We know where the Odyssey ends. There's no question about that. It ends with the return of Odysseus to his home in Ithaca after a 20-year absence. He spent 10 of those years fighting in Troy to recover Helen, and that story is told in the Iliad. And then he spent another 10 years trying to accomplish his own homecoming, his Nostos. The Odyssey doesn't tell the story of Troy because that's in the Iliad, which some of you may have read. It's very different from this poem in structure. The Odyssey comes across more actually as a readable novel, especially the second half, which becomes an adventure story. Where does the Odyssey start? When does this Council of the Gods on Olympus take place? So I just want you each to make a quick note on, I'm not going to ask you what you wrote down, but just write it down anywhere. Where do you think it starts, even whether you've read it or not? I hope you found a pencil. Okay, speaking chronologically, Athena calls this Council of the Gods almost at the end of the story. Athena is a protectress of Odysseus and his family, but another powerful god, Poseidon, god of the oceans, is an enemy of Odysseus. We find out the reason for this later in the epic, although it's already happened at the point we're talking about right now, which is a little confusing. Zeus has told Poseidon that he can cause difficulty for Odysseus on his homeward journey, but that he cannot kill him. All of the other Greeks who survived the war in Troy have now gotten home. They'd all come home within 7 years of the end of the war. 10 years have now passed and Odysseus is still not home, which is why many people assume he's dead. For the last 7 years, he's been held captive on the island of Ogygia, kept there by the sea nymph Calypso. And Athena has had enough of this, as you see in her words to Zeus in this caption on the slide. Odysseus lies away on an island suffering strong pains in the palace of Calypso, and she detains him by constraint, and he cannot make his way to his country. Athena has really picked her moment for calling for this council. Odysseus's enemy, Poseidon, god of the oceans, is not around. Your text tells you early on that he has gone far off to visit the Ethiopians, whose homeland is divided. Half of them live where the sun rises and half of them live where it sets. Scholars are still fine-tuning that concept, so go ahead and figure it out yourself. Athena knows Poseidon won't be around to argue against her. That's the story in short. And she tells Zeus that it's time to bring Odysseus home. So here's one image of Odysseus sitting on one artist's rendering, imaginative view of what Odysseus looked like, pretty much in what looks like Roman clothing here, weeping by the shore on Calypso's island. Here's a simplified rendering, but an accurate rendering of the actual Mediterranean Sea, with Turkey, where Troy is located, over on the right, and with the Greek archipelago just to the left of center, next to the heel of the boot-shaped Italian peninsula. And here is an imaginative rendering of Odysseus's possible route through the Mediterranean. We don't know exactly where the various places were where he stopped, but people have some reasons to argue for various locations. And so you can see what you think of this view. And you can notice here that as Odysseus travels with fewer men, the line tracking his journey gets thinner. It's a progressive loss of men as the epic goes on. As I mentioned a moment ago, early in those adventures, he made an enemy of Poseidon, but as an audience, we don't know about that yet. The contemporary Greek audience, however, did know. They would have known all of these background details quite well. The stories of the Trojan War had circulated for centuries, told by bards in the oral culture. I told you I'd get a lot of mileage out of this. 2 decisions were made by the gods who sat in council on Olympus while Poseidon was off. Zeus decreed that Odysseus was to be set free and that the job of telling Calypso to release him was to be delegated to the messenger god Hermes, while the job of going to Ithaca and stirring up Odysseus's son Telemachus, who's now about 20, was to be undertaken by Athena. So here is a picture of Hermes setting off, which he does immediately, but we will have to wait for 5 books before that plot thread is picked up again. Because at the same time as Hermes leaves, the muse chooses first to follow Athena. She goes to Ithaca to see if she can put some confidence in Telemachus. All of this, by the way, is pretty much happening on the first page of your book. She wants to get him to call an assembly, something which has not occurred in Ithaca since Odysseus left 20 years earlier. The situation in Ithaca is now critical. If Telemachus can't stand up to the suitors who want to marry his mother and take over control, Odysseus may not have a home to come back to, and then his story would not be much better than Agamemnon's. So here is, believe it or not, Athena on the right, disguised as Telemachus's old tutor, mentor. And Telemachus, of course, is on the left, a young man who is not quite yet motivated to stand up and take control. As a result of Athena's intervention, Telemachus does call a council, which is described in book 2. Significantly, there are some repeated formulaic passages that you will see again later in the epic. So try to watch for anything that sounds repetitive in your reading. And on that note, I really recommend reading with a pencil in hand and marking things in your book. If you have a paper book, if you've got, there is an online Lattimore, I realized, but I've had trouble finding it to recommend it to you. I like the paper version myself. At that council that takes place in Ithaca for the first time in 20 years, we not only learn that at least some of the suitors think they are capable of overpowering Odysseus, should he be alive and come back, but we also learn from one of them, Antinous, that Penelope's weaving strategy, which she has kept secret for the last 3 years, has recently been discovered. The reason she's been doing this for 3 years is because, as I said, by 7 years after the end of the war in Troy, everyone else had made it home. And at that point, the suitors started pressing her. So she said, I will make a decision about who to marry once I finish this shroud for my father-in-law. And she's been, I think you all know the strategy. She's been weaving it during the day and unweaving it at night. And the suitors have, like Athena with Zeus, the suitors have had enough and are insisting that Penelope should choose one of them. So you get the sense that everything is coming to a head. Here is a beautiful painting by Pinturicchio. And this captures Penelope in the suitors, rather. The suitors capture Penelope in the act of unweaving at night. Although it doesn't look very dark outside, but this might be one of those long, light Greek evenings. This is a very early 16th century portrayal of a household with a cat. Look at that little cat up in front. Somewhere on the Mediterranean, with Penelope dressed as a European housewife of the early Renaissance. Book 2 of the Odyssey will give you more detail about her delaying strategy. In book 19, a few more details will be filled in when Penelope speaks to the disguised Odysseus, whom she has not yet recognized. And then in the final book of the Odyssey, book 24, we learn a bit more about it, including some of the apparently magical aspects. So this is something I'm going to talk about with you in when we talk about in our final meeting, when you all have a sense of the epic as a whole. The final details that we hear about in the last book come out actually in a vignette, a small vignette of the suitors in Hades, where they are recalling Penelope's trickery, as they call it. Penelope's strategy of delay by weaving and unweaving is not mentioned at that Council of the Gods, but it seems to run parallel with the stories of the final weeks of Odysseus's travels from the island of the Phaeacians back to Ithaca, and also with the mini journey of Telemachus that we read about in the first 4 books. So as a plot thread, Penelope's story is clearly just as important as the experiences of her husband and son. It was as critical for her to hold off the suitors as it was for Telemachus to stand up to them and for Odysseus to make his way home. So it's my favorite sculpture. This is circumspect Penelope. She never leaves Ithaca, but her thoughts apparently travel everywhere, as her epithet implies. That long finger pointing towards her head signifies her circumspection. She sits still at the center of the action, but in her mind, she is following everything. I'd also like to note that it must be incredibly difficult to include a pointing finger like that in a sculpture. So the sculptor really had a point to make. That was an unintentional pun. All right, here, let's shift now to Telemachus does call a council, as I said. So I've made the point that those 3 plot threads are all equally important, and we will follow all 3 of them as we progress through our 3 sessions. So Telemachus does call a council, and in book 2, as the Ithacan assembly draws to an end, and it's not just the suitors, it's all the adult population of Ithaca, who should not be allowing the suitors to behave as badly as they're behaving. The suitors, of course, refuse what Telemachus asks them, and he invokes the gods, calling down a curse, which turns out to be prophetic. Go away from my palace, he says, even though he knows they will not leave, and do your feasting elsewhere, eating up your own possessions, taking turns household by household. This, of course, is what their parents should be telling them. But if you decide it is more profitable and better to go on eating up one man's livelihood without payment, then spoil my house. I will cry out to the gods everlasting in the hope that Zeus might somehow grant a reversal of fortune. Then you may perish in this house with no payment given. When I teach this to undergraduates, I don't explain what no payment given means. I wait for them to ask, which they almost never do because they want to assume they know. But this is a death payment. There will be no death payment. Your families will get no compensation. This will come up again in the last two books of the Odyssey. So I'm giving you more information than I give my undergraduates because you're better. So everybody's in place now. We've got Penelope sitting in Ithaca. We've got Odysseus sitting on the shoreline of Ogygia, Calypso's island. And this is sort of an advanced preview. If you look up in the upper left, you can see Hermes, who has delivered his message to Calypso, and she is about to deliver it to Odysseus that she now has to let him go. And Hermes going back, he's going back to Olympus. So I want to give you an overview of the divisions of the Odyssey by book. And this is something you can refer back to or not. But in books 1 to 4, as I've said, we deal with Telemachus. In books 5 to 8, Odysseus, who has been allowed to leave Ogygia, travels to the land of the Phaeacians, or the Phaeacians, as Lattimore spells it. And that's books 5 to 8. We will look tonight in our discussion section at a passage of when Odysseus first arrives there. That's an exciting arrival. He is almost drowning and manages to pull himself ashore. While he's there, he recapitulates his 10 adventures, and that takes place in books 9 to 12. And then by book 13, Odysseus and Telemachus have both returned to Ithaca. This is when it turns into more of an adventure story than the epic tale that we've been following so far. Odysseus arrives in disguise. He does not let anyone know who he is, and he tests the loyalty of each of a small group of allies in turn. He won't even let himself acknowledge that his old dog, Argus, wants to say hello, because people would know who he was if they saw that his dog recognized him. That's a very sad moment. Okay, so you have this to refer to. My PowerPoint is behaving badly. Okay, so Telemachus, this is not Telemachus, this is a picture of Odysseus, but I cannot find, no one seems to have illustrated Telemachus's successful escape from Ithaca past the blockade set up by the suitors, because they want to kill him now. Now that he has stood up to them, they don't want him around to cause problems for them. So they have tried to ambush him, and he leaves with Athena's help, and she puts together a crew of about 12 Greek friends of his. So the boat might have looked like this. This, again, is a later artist's late 1800s rendering, John Waterhouse. I'm not an expert on seagoing craft from the time of the Odyssey, but it would be a fairly simple boat. And these, of course, are the sirens, one of the adventures Odysseus will have, and we come to that adventure later. I just want to show you a boat. Telemachus leaves by water, in other words. And he goes to visit two heroes of the Trojan War. And as far as we know, this is the first time Telemachus gets any sense of proper guest host behavior. He's grown up in a tilted household, not his mother's fault, but there's been no male power figure there. And there's been this horde of suitors who are not being properly supervised by their families. So Telemachus needs to go and travel and see how things are properly done. So I think if you read his small epic, the Telemachy, with that in mind, you'll enjoy the detail. So what I'm showing you here, I really just want you to have the sense that he has left Ithaca. I hope you can see my pointer. Ithaca is the turquoise island up on the left here. He has gone by boat to the Greek mainland, and there he's visiting Pylos and Sparta. So he's no longer traveling by boat, he's traveling by horse. So when you're reading that episode where he goes quickly from one to the other and then has to rush back because he has to go back to Ithaca, you know he's on the mainland and he goes by boat back and forth from Ithaca. Okay, so here he's participating in a sacrifice in Pylos, officiated over by Nestor, who's one of the heroes of the Trojan War and a friend of his father's. And he's literally seeing the proper way to participate in a sacrificial ceremony, which is another way of providing meat for the feasting that's going to go on because they have a special guest. That's a less reverential view of what's happening, but it's a very solemn procedure. And then he goes to Sparta, where he visits King Menelaus, who's the brother of King Agamemnon, whom I mentioned earlier was ambushed by his wife's lover when he came home. Telemachus is on the left weeping because he's just heard stories about his father. Athena, disguised as Mentor, is behind him on the left. Helen, on the right, is taking the opportunity to give her version of how her behavior, which started this whole war, was defensible. So you can keep that in mind when you read that. So finally, these visits to the palaces of Nestor and Agamemnon are not just opportunities for Telemachus to learn about proper behavior. They're also excellent opportunities for us as readers to see what kind of social expectations were in play in ancient Greek households. And we'll learn more about that when we see how Odysseus behaves when he gets to Phaeacia and has to learn how to approach his host and hostess there. I'm going to complicate things just a little in a minute, but first let's review that slide I showed earlier, the division of the Odyssey into books, which is not here. Here it is. I think I just wanted to remind you that this is where we're going to pick up next time. I got my slides slightly out of order here, but you've already enjoyed this picture enough, I believe. Here I've highlighted Hermes just to show you him there, but we've dealt with this. So this is where we're going to pick Odysseus up next time. His trip to Phaeacia will be the starting point for our discussion. Today, though, I'm repeating this slide of the division by books. I think just because I wanted you to have it on hand at the end. So just to sum up, we open with the proem or introduction with the invocation of the muse, the journey of Telemachus, Odysseus's adventure with the Phaeacians, where he tells all of his stories, his 10 adventures, and then the second half of the Odyssey, books 13 to 24, which takes place almost entirely in Ithaca. And I don't know why I'm saying almost here, but it's virtually entirely in Ithaca. And as I've said, there's a change of tone at about halfway through as Odysseus comes back and tries to put together his supporters. So the hero of this epic proceeds cautiously, He shows incredible self-control. And finally, the last person he reveals his true identity to is Penelope. Although I always have a suspicion she's figured it out already, but see what you think when you read. He approaches her very cautiously. And then, as I said, the final vignette of the defeated suitors. And what appears to be a resolution that some people argue is a later addition, but many things have been added to the Odyssey over the centuries by a process of accretion, that the bards added things before. The Odyssey was finally, when writing became available, was finally written down in its canonical form. But before that, it was undergoing a process of evolution. And I could talk more about this another time. Ask me questions about it if you would like to. I'm also going to give you a bibliography, a short bibliography of books on oral formulaic culture. One of the final things I wanted to say is that each adventure of Odysseus and his crew either represents a threat to their homecoming, such as the lotus eaters and the harpies want to make them forget about going home, or the adventure actually involves lost homecomings, such as the men eaten by the Cyclops, or the ones that get picked off by Scylla and Charybdis. Each of these sequential adventures, the lotus eaters, the Cyclops, the sirens, is a potentially lost homecoming. So this is a complicated diagram, and I invite conversation, but the three circles represent these three themes, these three plot lines that I've been talking about. If you take these adventures to be the stories that Odysseus tells the Phaeacians about his journeys, everything that these three circles represent takes place in those last 30 days after he leaves the island of, I've remembered her name, all the way through, don't tell me, I will block it now. But after he leaves the island of Ogygia, Calypso's island, his trip home, Telemachus's trip out and back, Penelope's dealing with the suitors after they discover her plot, all of that follows the same temporal continuum. So you can meditate over this too in between reading. If it's not helpful, just ignore it. Even Nausicaa, the young woman that Odysseus meets when he comes to the island of Phaeacia, is a threat to his homecoming because she's marriageable and her father really likes him as a suitable prospect. So Odysseus has to walk very carefully in that last stop before he returns to Ithaca. So I think you might enjoy the sort of humor in that if you keep that in mind.